All right, hi everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. I'm kind of looking at, talking about how humans have been automated over the last 120 years. So it's a little bit of a follow-up of the last video that I did where I discussed or talked about how the mind and the body is like a computer, and how our mind is more like the software, our physical body is more of like the hardware. And people do, I think, have understood that the computer and social media has broken us down, has affected critical thinking. However, after I did that video, I remembered a conversation that I had with a personal training client who worked for Regions Health Insurance. So she was a very smart and intelligent woman, very logical. And this is back in like 2017, 2018. And the conversation that we had was just about current events. And she told me about how she read an article about how children who are using Lego kits today actually have less critical thinking skills, a little bit less creativity as compared to the kids who were brought up in the 80s, 70s, and prior, who just had a big bucket of Legos. And so I thought that was really interesting because I thought about that at the time, and it makes sense. Like when you have a prefabricated kit, you're receiving something to do that specific thing. So you might buy a kit to buy a Lego dragon, or you might buy a kit to create a skyscraper. But when you're a kid chocked full of a bunch of imagination, and you take a bucket of Legos and you dump it on the ground, you have to use some sort of critical thinking or imagination or dreaming to kind of create certain things that you want, whether it's a certain structure or a color scheme of a building or something like that. So it is really, really interesting if you think about that. Now, I was born in 1985, so if you do think about the degeneration process of the younger generation, they are not set up as well as early millennials, 70 babies, and baby boomers. America was once, still is to some degree, the leader, the most advanced country in the world for the most part, and a lot of that has to do with having higher intellect and intelligence, better engineering skills and things like that. So it is really interesting to see kind of how probably the baby boomers were the last generation to really have quality education. Some of us early millennials had a little bit of good quality education because we're still, have been able to break out of certain things. But I do remember my awakening and breaking out process really happened after I went to India and I did all that yoga and meditation. I do remember when I was there, I thought, Jesus, if I started college actually after I went to India, I think I would have comprehended information better. I think I would have did better on certain exams and scores on certain tests. Anyways, don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I want to share some thoughts. It's going to be a little bit hard to see through a computer screen and you can't feel anything, so it might not be a great example. But I do want to talk about how I have been seeing this automation of humans over the last 100 years, 120 years, probably around 1880 to 1890. They still kind of had it in that 1800s Victorian era, but really starting at the 1920 marker is when things really started to shift and change in the world of creativity. Now, I am going to be sharing examples of textiles, of stuff that I've learned to look at how there has been a breaking down of creativity, but also a breaking down of quality, and kind of just go through the timeline with you to really start to understand certain things. This is kind of important because the computers have accelerated our laziness, have accelerated the degeneration process of thinking and creativity. I mean, I guess creativity is, people are still taking iPads and drawing pictures on there, and calligraphy, and loading them up on the internet. So in some degrees it is a little bit different. However, for the mass scale of humans, what we are producing today is nothing as compared to what our ancestors produced, especially when everything was done by hand. So I hope just getting this little visualization can kind of help see how this automation has been happening for the last century. And it's just, the computer was kind of like the freight train that just went pedal to the metal, fully on to decreasing our creativity skills. And if you are all about artistry or all about spirituality, and they talk about creation and creative energy, this is really, really important to have to get back into this, because that is something that has been disconnected or maybe suppressed to some degree. So I'm going to be talking about a couple things. I had some quilt examples, but maybe quilts are a little harder to talk about because there's so much that goes into that. But what I will say in terms of quilts is our ancestors wasted nothing. Granny's generation, little Depression era babies and before, were a lot more green than we are today, because as they were going through the war, they took flour sacks, they took anything that held feed or food, cut them up and put that material into making clothing, especially quilts. They took all that scrap fabric and made something that was a beautiful compilation. I have a couple quilts right here. I'm just trying to think if I should share those examples. I have a great example. It's just in the other room. They, instead of making this beautiful pattern, they just kind of chopped and took everything up and made it into quilts. Maybe at the end of the video, depending on how long this is, I'll just go ahead and grab that really quick. So back in, let's just say pre-1920s, our ancestry, 1700s, 1800s, if you're looking at something like needlepoint or making linen, what they used to do was take a piece of linen such as this, and they would just take needle and thread and start embroidering. If you're looking at a cross stitch pattern or a needlepoint panel, they had different material for that, but I don't know if they necessarily like etched anything out with a pencil. That I'm not sure. I'd have to look into the history of it. But what I do know is that there was the creativity was just there. You had a blank piece of canvas, just like a painter in the 1700s had a blank canvas. They were staring out at the landscape and they tried to copy what was in the landscape on canvas. So from here, you kind of had this this moment of creation, like I have this linen panel or to use for cross stitch, or this specifically is a table runner, but what am I going to do to create this? So that all of this stuff was generally used with a lot of embroidery and lace. And where are my other things? Oh, there they are. Okay. So what you see a lot is this is 100% pure linen. It's a very high quality linen that was used in the early 1900s, pre-1920s. Some of these, I don't know, this one not specifically, from the 1800s is high quality linen. This tattered lace here was all hand crocheted and then eventually crocheted onto the edge. And then you also have this cut work where you can see that they've cut and shredded the linen at the side to give it a little bit of a design. This one's a beautiful example. This one actually might be European. But you can see this eloquent cut work and design that they did. They obviously punctured holes in it, but this is all hand embroidered, done by hand. And when you look at old textiles, you can tell when something is machine embroidered versus hand embroidered. This is the back side. This is certainly hand embroidered, and you can tell that they did this all by the creation of their eye and hand. Now, how do I know that? It's because in the 1920s, it might have happened a little bit earlier, but you started seeing things come out in the 1920s and the 1930s of stamping. So what people used to do to make things easier, so instead of doing everything by eye and hand and having to figure it out, companies started figuring it out for you. So you have these iron-on patches, and you could choose any sort of design that you want. This might be upside down, I don't know, but pretty much what you would do is if you wanted this rooster chicken, you would put the rooster chicken down on the panel, and then you would hot iron it so it stamps on there. This stamp specifically is probably a 40s, 50s style because it's red. If you find these that are blue, generally a lot of times they're 1920 and 30s. There are stamped kits that are blue. Like for example, you could just tell by the packaging of this. This is specifically like 60s, 70s style. So you can always tell by the font that it's a little bit different. This font on here looks more 1940s, but this was the first step to making things easier. So they would take this linen, hot iron it, and then they would use whatever color thread combination that they thought of up here and applied it onto the panel. When you started moving toward the 40s, 50s, and into the mid-century is when we started to get actual kits. So if you were looking to do a needlepoint kit, you would get this 100% linen panel that was already pre-stamped. They gave you instructions. They gave you the picture of the book or the panel that you started doing. And they gave you all the thread as well as they gave you the needle. So really, you didn't have to, you took the process out of thinking about what you're gonna do, how you're gonna recreate this. But they provided everything for you. Everything was pre-stamped, it was already done, it was in a kit. Now this one is a reproduction of a 1927 Bless This House poem that was presented or hung in the White House. So this is kind of rare to find, but what you see, this was recreated in 1975, but when you start going down the mid-century rabbit hole is that you start seeing a lot of reproductions of things that our ancestors already made. It's like I said, it's like the prefabricated housing. It's prefabricated, it's already done for you. We put everything together in this little kit. You just have to follow the directions and you have to follow along. So that is important because it was, okay, so that's important because that's kind of like the next stepping stone to automating our creation. What has broken down in the 1980s and 90s is that things started to get exported and shipped out. So things started to be made in Taiwan and in China. Now, the mid-century did have a lot of imports coming in from Japan. So anything post-World War II did have a lot of imports. However, the 50s, 60s, and 70s still had a little bit of quality. If you got one of these cross-stitch kits back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you probably got 100% linen. A lot of kits in the 1950s used Belgian linen or Irish linen, so it was still using some quality. Now, when you start going in the 80s and 90s, things get broken down even further. It's a more synthetic cotton blend, and then the panel points are even color-coded for you. This is not always like this. There are many 90s panels that are still just one color, and then you have to buy the thread and such, but it is just an example at how you start seeing things just becoming easier and easier. So it's almost like all of these corporations have just made things a lot easier, and that's what computers and the internet and all of that have done for us today, right? So instead of typing on a typewriter, and then if you messed up, you have to go back and white it out and then retype over it, now you just hit the backspace button and everything is digital and it makes it easier and easier. Needlepoint kits were kind of the same thing. You get this pre-painted panel and you just have to fill it in with the yarn that they give you, and they give you the little color-coded yarn here. You have a set of instructions that tell you where to put everything. Obviously, this type of stuff is super, super easy for beginners when you're looking at something that is blank. That is blank linen and you're just given the thread. This is going to use a lot more skill. This is called hardinger. This is from Norway. And actually with with a lot of European kits I found, they don't pre-stamp things for you. So they're still not stuck, but they're still attached to the old world way of doing things. Instead of you gathering the linen and you measuring it out and cutting it and figuring out what type of design that you want to do, they make it a little bit easier for you by providing instructions, the linen, the thread, They might provide the needle, but you have to figure it out still. They won't stamp it. I don't see many pre-stamped stuff in the European market. I'm buying all vintage stuff too, so this is stuff from the 60s and 70s I don't know about right now and today. So I know that is just kind of for some people like super boring, but if you start to, my eyes have been opened from about this topic because I continuously started seeing it. I started seeing how these beautiful things made 100 years ago are using super high quality fabrics and linen. It was abundant back then to some degree. I mean, what was available was natural fibers, cotton and linen and wool. Now today, it's like the natural fiber world, like full on linen. If you were to buy this from a shop, this could be like $200 to $300 to get a friggin' couple yards of just pure 100% linen. It's insane. So all the prefabricated stuff, so if you're looking at the inversion, you kind of see this rise of automation, the rise of making things easier, and the decrease of making things more synthetic, less natural fiber, less connection to the natural world. So when you go down a rabbit hole and you kind of find, when you start looking at this stuff weekly and every day, you can see the connection. The breaking down of humans starting in the Industrial Revolution is not just about farming. It's about kind of our whole entire lifestyle. It even has affected the art and the textile world. In the 1920s and 30s, you started getting a lot of the stamped linens. This is mid-century, but the stamped linen kind of, replaced a lot of the embroidery stuff, a lot of the embroidery cross-stitch. So people found it, as women started to go to work in the mid-century, they didn't always have a lot of time to sit and cross-stitch like they did, 50, 60 years prior to that. So they started making stamped linens. Once again, it's just kind of like the digital recreation of what we used to do by eye and hand. I do think the baby boomers are kind of some of the last generation of crafters that is kind of leaving, because you had most of those women were stay-at-home moms. The ones who were in good conditions, home conditions, definitely were like, their houses are chock full of crafts and needlepoint kits. And the other thing I wanted to share is that everything from the mid-century and before had not only more connection to the natural world and connection to artistry, but more connection to spirituality and to God. So I don't know if you can read this. It's probably backwards, but it says, can't even read it backwards. Let's see. It says, this kitchen is seasoned with love, and then there's love is, sorry, I'm just gonna do this. Loving hearts make a house a home. You have his and hers. I have another one in the back, which is all pretty much God-related quotes. So it's like, there's the serenity prayer. There's more connection to a belief and faith in God. And when you start looking at quilts and the history of America, you know that all of these textiles were created with love, but in spirit, to keep the pioneers warm as they traveled across the country. Or it's a recreation of spirituality. I know one of these, this is a more biblical stamping. So people would stamp their linens and have, this connection of what they believe in on the table or on the wall. And you don't see a whole lot of that today. I think I might do a separate video of like this versus that, or then versus now. I'm gonna go ahead and just pull out this quilt really quick. All right, so this is an antique quilt. I believe it's from the early 1900s. I'm still trying to figure it out. But the workmanship on some of the feathering at the corner, you might not be able to see it, but this takes a lot of time. I mean, for some women, this could have taken 1 to 2 years. So obviously this is a pattern of what they would get in the newspaper. In the 30s and 40s and 50s, you had a lot of newspaper clippings, and in the 20s. Some of these things are just kind of created by hand and birth. I'm going to take a pause a moment and grab this other quilt here. Okay. So in the beginning of the video, I said how our ancestors wasted nothing, and so they used all this scrap fabric. This is called Nile green. It came out in 1929, but there is absolutely no pattern of this quilt. You can tell that this person randomly took any sort of fabric that they had, and they created this patchwork pattern of squares of different sizes. Some were rectangles depending on what they used, and they just kind of created an eclectic pattern. So there really is no rhyme or rhythm, just with the exception that both ends are in the Nile green. So like I said, Granny was a little greener back then because they absolutely wasted nothing. They did not waste an ounce of that fabric. They figured out how to use it for anything, even if it was a kitchen towel. So I hope this has been helpful. Just to kind of get a brief little rundown, or at least a visual, because we are very visual in this world, especially being brought up in America and our education system. I have noticed that when I moved to Australia in 2005, the educational system was a lot different. And I was like, oh my God, I'm really dumb, or at least like our country's been dumbed down a lot, because what they did is you have a lecture hall and you have a book and you have the teacher in the front, and it was pretty much, he would go over some stuff, they would give you a book, an assignment, and you had to figure it out. Where in America, the education system was a little more spoon-fed. Everything was kind of handed or given to you. Like the teacher handed out homework. I mean, they handed out homework, I guess, in Australia, but it kind of followed this itinerary. It was like, this is the 10 weeks, this is what you're supposed to do. So everything was a little more broken down for us in America, whereas in other countries, it was more of you figure it out. So as I've seen that with something like this example of the European textile, where they'll give you the thread and the panel, but you still have to figure it out. There is no stamp, there is no pattern that you have to follow. You should follow the directions on here to recreate this, but it's not spoon-fed. So I hope this brings a little bit of awareness, and I would love to hear your thoughts. So automation has been going on for a long, long time, and it has just been accelerated in this new century, in this new era. And yeah, thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. Have a great day. See you later. Bye-bye.